I have just been advised that Cardinal Bergoglio from Argentina has been elected Pope.
I just want to do the field, so he'll know where it is. And you can pick it up, put it to your mouth, and you're ready to talk.
Yes, please, sir.
Hi, Owen. How are you?
Anyway, you tell me to sit. Where do I sit? I sit there. I'll sit here. Yeah.
We have to get together one of these days soon.
Why don't you sit?
Formalize it.
All right. Okay. Okay. You got it. Deal with my legs better.
How you doing? I'm trying to.
Nice seeing you.
Perfect. It's at 2 o'clock, so I'm going to take off the lid. And water's at 2 o'clock.
I'll sit right next to you, Peter.
Excellent.
Is that all right?
Absolutely. What's that? I don't know. I don't think we need another chair, do we?
No, we've got Henry. Henry's here. Dick Allen isn't going to be here.
Okay.
So
Your
yeah.
mics are open. Your mic is live. Just want to warn you, your mic is live.
Okay. Okay.
Is Bruce Davis here? I have these lights on me. I can't see. Is Bruce Davis here? Well, you got me back. That was a great panel. I have to admit, I just said to, no, I won't get into that. The next panel is going to address a favorite topic of mine. During the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had something called the Cold War. We no longer have the Cold War. A lot of people have you believe that just happened. It didn't just happen. It was planned. The whole national security policy of the Reagan administration was to make sure that that would happen. And as we all know, it was successful. And there is no Cold War. This afternoon's panel is going to look at how that came about, and is going to talk about the steps that were taken to ensure that would happen. On the panel we have, and I got to figure out if I have everybody here, I hope I do, Dr. John Lachowski, who we've heard from earlier. He's the president of the Institute of World Politics. Mr. Joe Detrani. Joe Detrani was a very important part of the agency activities. Somewhere around here, I'm not going to read it though, I have his bio, but I'm not going to get into that. I have not done that yet. But in addition to serving a stint as Special Assistant, Executive Assistant to the DCI, Bill Casey, he was sent to China. And today he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people about our relationships with China. He has recently left service and is president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. He's teaching, and he's a great expert, particularly on our relationships with China. We have Peter Schweitzer. I see him over there somewhere. Many of you have seen some of his books. He wrote a book called Victory. I think I heard a story, correct me if I'm wrong, you know I've never just talked about this, that you got your degrees and so on, and you were a specialist in Soviet studies, and you realized what happened to Soviet. Yeah. So he wrote a book about it, and he documented the fact that an awful lot of it was the result of our planning to make sure that happened. We have General Ed Rowney, who was Chief of Strategy in Arms Negotiation during the Reagan administration. We have Henry Now, who was Director of International Economic Affairs at the National Security Council. Did I get everybody? Okay. So have you guys decided among yourselves who wants to start?
Joe, why don't you
Do you want to start?
start, Joe?
2 minutes?
Okay, Joe. Okay, Joe. Thank you.
Just a few minutes. Thank you, Owen. Bernadette, thank you. It's really an honor being here this morning. Some of the great presentations talking about such a great man. It gives one energy and gives one hope, and it's exciting. It's exciting hearing all of you. I came by meeting Director Casey a little different than most of you. I was overseas. I was an intelligence officer coming back from overseas. Bob Gates suggested I go and meet with the new director. I just got back from overseas, Director Casey, and they were looking for an executive assistant. I really said, I'm an overseas officer, and I sat down with Bill Casey, and I tell you, there was only one person I wanted to work for, and I'm being very honest here. Anybody who knows me knows I kind of shoot straight that way. This was a gracious man. I never met the man before. I never saw a picture of the man before. I just got back, and Bob said, go in and meet him. And very gracious, sat down, went in his office. He's a big man. I looked at his desk, and it was a mess. The impression was, my God, he must be inundated with all the work here. And again, this is a new agency, and doesn't have the background and what have you, but he was gracious. He spent the time, and he said, come join the team.
Joe, everybody talks about his desk being a mess, but can you imagine the job Betty Murphy had in clearing it off and putting it all back in the safe every night?
Betty Murphy was a safe. She was just great. But I tell you though, Owen, although the desk was he knew every piece of paper on that desk. And all those books that were stacked up, he had read those books. And I got to know that because I was an executive assistant. I would get in there before he got in the office, and he got in very early at 7, so it's a long day. And he left very late, about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, so it's a long day. And that material on that desk he read. He was intimate with the work of the Central Intelligence Agency and the whole intelligence community. He knew the people. He knew the authors. He was in touch with the national intelligence officers. He would bring them in. And his sense was, this is such a great organization, such a great community. You need to be out there. And he brought vigor. He brought energy and enthusiasm. Mind you, at that period of time, we were sort of on a lull. We went through a bad patch. And this man came back, and he was close to the president. He had a vision, and he knew the work from his OSS days. So some of my initial impressions were, well, he's dealing with a lot of sophisticated officers who were overseas officers. He's very sophisticated, but he doesn't have that intimate overseas. So maybe he could be, we could spin things, and maybe, he'd be susceptible on the country. He was on top of his play, He knew the business from his OSS days. He engendered great respect from the operators, the analysts and the operators. Those are case officers who worked overseas to collect it, and those analysts who put it together. He had great respect for them, and he would meet with them, and we inculcate with them that you got to be enthusiastic about it. Some impressions. I read everything. He was an avid reader, as everyone, Judge Sporkin and everyone said. He was a voracious appetite. He was a great writer. So he had his own speechwriter. We had people who would prepare him for cabinet meetings. And it was great working with these people because they did a lot of work, and when we'd get it, he'd look at it, and he'd change everything. And they, you know, oh my goodness. And he's getting in the elevator to go and meet with the president, and he's changing it. And he's sending it back to the author and saying, you know, you really didn't express it the way I wanted it. A lot of frustration there, but it spoke to his perfectionism. He wanted each word proper. He wanted to convey the message in a meaningful way. But people enjoyed that because it gave them that much more of a challenge to meet his expectations, which were extremely, extremely high. We heard a little about he was articulate, he wrote well, but he also spoke extremely well. Now, if he was on Congress and he didn't like the questions, he'd mumble. And that's a strategy. It's not a bad one. I've learned that afterwards also. I think many of us, you know, you don't like that. But he conveyed it. He was very powerful. He brought a sense of management to the intelligence community, and certainly the CIA. I remember him giving a book out, In Search of Excellence, to each of the senior managers, and having a meeting and talking about it. Let's go into the management. Are we managing well? Are we managing our people well? Are we mentoring? We only have a short period of time. He was anxious. He was impatient. He was very impatient. You remind me a lot when you think about China, because that's a little my background. Deng Xiaoping was impatient when he came in 1979. You got to go forward. Bill Casey was impatient. And what was he impatient for? The defeat of communism. His vision, working with the president. The vision, defeat communism wherever it is. If it's in Afghanistan, he did it in Afghanistan. How did he do it in Afghanistan? He brought a coalition of the willing. He worked with the Saudi Arabians. He worked with China. We were able in China to get material into the Mujahideen and so forth. And the Soviets were defeated. They had their best forces, the Sputniks. And I remember some of the analysts who put out papers in the beginning of that saying, there's no way the Soviets could be defeated in Afghanistan. With the power they have in there, they were defeated. And this was, and I give, Bill Casey was the architect of that. And he worked that, and he worked it hard, and he did it quietly. And that's where all the pieces came together. SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. His point was you could bankrupt the Soviet Union. I don't think we have capabilities with all their strategic forces, whether it's 9,000 nuclear warheads and ICBMs that can reach us, we will have a shield. And that's when the president spoke about Star Wars, SDI, and so forth. That was Casey's view. Get it out there, because eventually the Soviets are going to spend every penny they have trying to defeat our capabilities, our countermeasures, and so forth. And we saw that happening. We saw that coming into play. Get information into the people in Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Union, because truth is powerful. You don't have to manipulate anything. Just get the truth in there. Let the people realize how rogue those regimes are and so forth. And we saw that happening. Interesting for me, because when I came back, I worked for Bill Casey for almost 3 years. Then I went overseas, and I came back and I worked for him again. And a lot of that was getting information out. And it was very, very powerful. Unfortunately, he passed away. But 2 years after he had passed, I remember in Beijing with the Tiananmen incident. In Beijing at the Tiananmen incident, we also had the visit of Gorbachev, if you remember that. The Chinese didn't meet him. They had the ceremony at the airport, now the great hall of the people, because of the demonstrations at Tiananmen. And you will see this in Kissinger's book. Kissinger was mentioned this morning in the book. Gorbachev came to Beijing at that time for what? They wanted a loan from China. They wanted money from China. Could you imagine this? How bankrupt they were. Bankrupt not only in a material sense, but bankrupt intellectually and morally. Because 2 years after that, there was the whole demise of the Soviet Empire. It came down. And that, I think, Peter, you captured that so well. This is the legacy of Bill Casey. This is the Bill Casey I knew, who brought energy to an agency, who inculcated a spirit there, who got people out meeting there, having them produce the highest levels, having high expectations and having them go for it and so forth. But having a vision and being patient with it and moving forward, and then recognizing excellence. Because it was said by many people here, whether you were his driver, whether you was his executive assistant, or whether you were the president on the cabinet, he treated people that way. This was a man you wanted to be with, a very gracious man, a man who indeed, just by his nature, was a leader. And I can tell you this was a great experience for me, and John Helgeson spoke a little this afternoon. He's doing some work on that, an agency colleague of mine. I think Bill Casey will go down as one of our greatest, not only greatest directors of Central Intelligence, but one of our greatest Americans. So it's being an honor invited here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add to that? I'm going to add a quick story to that. You know, the United States were great supporters of solidarity. And I remember one time this is a Casey story, I got a phone call from Bill Casey. And he said, you know the people in London that make mimeograph machines? And I did have some contact with them, so I knew who they were. He said, get 50 that don't require electricity. Get 50 hand ones. And we'll let you know where they're supposed to go. And at a luncheon about 2 or 3 years ago at the Institute of World Politics, I told that story to La Coenza. Yes, that was Solidarity's newspaper. That's how Solidarity published their newspaper. They got to Poland. He picked them up outside of Warsaw, and they used them for the newspaper. Who wants to go next? Peter? Okay.
Well, I'm a little bit handicapped on this panel because everyone here played a role in the Reagan administration and had contact with Bill Casey. I was actually a college student in the 1980s. Had Henry Now as a professor, and then went off to Oxford University, where I did my master's thesis, completed in 1990, on the future of the Soviet military. 6 months later, the Soviet Union fell apart, so the timing wasn't all that great. But that did get me interested in this question of exactly what Owen said, and that is, how did this happen? And I don't really have personal stories to tell in the context that others do, but let me just make sort of two broad comments that I think are vital on this. The first one is looking at the paper trail. And by that I mean that very much from the Reagan administration has been declassified now, and you can actually go through and look at those documents. And when you put them in the context of American foreign policy since the beginning of the Cold War.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Sure.
The disc in the back of your handout that you received when you registered, the disc contains all of those documents.
Fantastic.
And the one note that I was told I have to tell you is, for some reason you have to double click it. Now, I'm not quite sure what that means, but there's probably some people who know more about computers than I do who realize what that means, but you have to double click it to get into it.
And those documents are so interesting because you have things like National Security Decision Directives, NSDDs, which were the sort of the top secret strategy documents that I'm sure people at this panel actually were involved in writing. But if you look at, say, for example, NSDD 32, which was sort of the grand strategy or global strategy of the Reagan administration, it talks about the fact that we need to have an offensive strategy, that we need to look for opportunities and ways to roll back Soviet power. That was a pretty revolutionary idea in foreign policy, to actually embrace that idea and then develop some ways in which they could do that. Or if you look at, I think it's NSDD 53, which was on Eastern Europe, the same thing. It was not talking about accepting Soviet dominion over Eastern Europe. It was saying we need to look for opportunities to pull these countries out of the Soviet orbit. Or NSDD 75, which was on Soviet foreign policy, which talked about the fact that they had economic vulnerabilities and we needed to look for ways to exploit those vulnerabilities to our advantage. Certainly the panel here can talk about some of the ways in which that was carried out, but that was the strategy that was laid out, and Bill Casey was a central component of that. You had the Reagan Doctrine, which was really a brilliant idea in that it said we are going to, instead of sending the military everywhere, we're going to arm local individuals who are tired of Soviet rule or who want to resist Soviet power. And this was a strategy, by the way, that drove the Soviets nuts, because if you look in the Soviet archives, what you find is a lot of complaints about the fact that this is a sort of go-cheap strategy by the United States. You know, the Soviet military is pouring all this aid into Africa and Latin America and into Afghanistan, and the Americans are pouring in maybe 10 to 15% of what we do, and they're still winning. So there's a very, very clear role, central role that Bill Casey played in the Reagan doctrine and also on the economic side, which is saying we're going to fight the Cold War in a different way. We're not going to play to the Soviet strengths, which is to mass produce things like tanks. We're going to go and we're going to exploit their weaknesses, which is in the realm of economics and in the realm of high technology, their inability to match us when it comes to military technology. The second thing I want to emphasize and mention is that there's also a fair amount of material that's come out from the East German Stasi and from the Soviet archives. Those have been closed now, but there is information available. And what's fascinating about this, and I think is completely forgotten, unfortunately, in a lot of the discussions that people have about the end of the Cold War, is the central role that what Bill Casey and the Reagan administration was doing, the central role that that played in the rise to power of Mikhail Gorbachev. The sense that some people have is that what the Kremlin did in picking Gorbachev, it just sort of happened in isolation. It was his turn. They'd had a bunch of these old leaders, Andropov and Chernenko, who had died, so they picked this young guy, Gorbachev. If you actually look at the minutes of the Politburo as that selection process took place, two things stand out. Number one, they were frustrated as all get out with what the Reagan administration was doing. They talk about the fact that, we extend an olive branch in terms of some peace initiative, and they basically ignore it and keep building up their military and keep advancing in these areas. The second thing that comes out in those discussions is their view that the only way that they were going to be able to compete with the United States under Ronald Reagan was to move towards radical reform. And by that I mean not that everyone was aboard, but the KGB, the foreign ministry, even elements of the military, in these meetings talk about the fact that Gorbachev and a reform agenda has to be done because otherwise we're doomed. We're going to be left behind the United States. So I think it's very important when you discuss with people about how the Cold War ended and the role that Gorbachev played in that. I think there's very, very clear evidence that Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey made Gorbachev possible. That if the United States had adopted a détente policy, as had been done by Jimmy Carter and others, there would not have been this external pressure on the Soviet system. They would not have felt the need to reform. So, in short, I'm going to cede this to the individuals here who were participants, but certainly I think that there is lots of evidence, powerful evidence, that Bill Casey played a vital role in bringing about the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was not something that happened in isolation, but it's something that happened as a result of external pressure that pushed the Soviet Union over the brink. And with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel.
General Rowney was the chief strategic arms negotiator during the Reagan administration, and maybe he would like to add to the what we've had to date. General?
Thank you. I remember when Casey and Ed Meese and a few other people were working with Ed Fuller during the campaign on the playbook. And they were working on the first 100 days. What will we do? We're going to win, and when we win, what will we do? Well, when I became the chief negotiator, I had the privilege of sitting in on the cabinet meetings, and there was one member there who had been in that formation, and when Reagan got to a point, he'd say, well, we've done that now. What's the next point, Bill, in the playbook? So all the other cabinet members were stunned, but Casey would tell them, well, this is what we do next, Mr. President. Another thing I remember is that we're sitting around one day, and the all the cabinet members are complaining. Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, the Secretary of Human Services, Arms Control Agency, all saying, Mr. President, you just can't go along with this peace through strength policy. You can't spend this kind of money for defense. You have double-digit inflation. You have double-digit unemployment. And at this point, Casey is shaking his head no. And Reagan said, gentlemen, he said, I'm the President of the United States, and my mission, my charge is to provide for the security of the United States, and that security of the United States requires that we have enough strength, because if you want to have strength, you want to have peace, civis pacem para bellum. He didn't say that, but I remember the old saying, if you want to have peace, it goes through strength. So I remember that Casey was a great player there. Casey had great rapport with Reagan, and I found out on another occasion. I was in the White House when Ed Rollins came in, said, Mr. President, we've decided so-and-so is going to get such and such a job. And he said, okay, Mr. President. And he said, well, I don't know. Have you checked it out with Casey? And I said, no. He said, check it out with Casey. If Casey says okay, he's in. If he doesn't, he's out. So he had very good power. I knew that again when I had a partner. We were both ambassador rank and both special advisors to the president, and he was Paul Nitze, a very distinguished, dignified guy, and a fair-haired boy of the Secretary of State, which I was not. Nitze was a little left of center, and I was a little right of center. Well, when we got into a knockdown drag-out on where to go, and I wanted to win, I would call up Casey and say, Bill, I need some help. And in the cabinet meeting, when it looked like the vote was going against me, Casey would speak up, and every time he spoke up, I won. Matter of fact, I kept score, and on 20 of these different confrontations with Nitze and myself, I won 18 times, and Nitze twice, all due to, or most of it due to Casey. Another thing I remember about Casey was during the, we told him that this statement, dovere no provere, he would say, well, I can get that, and he learned it pretty well. He said, you mean the deal with cut the cars, don't you? And he said, yes, that's what I mean. Verification. He absolutely believed in verification and inequality, and we could never quite convince all the people in the State Department and the Arms Control Agency on those points, but Casey was right there in that same corner of saying that, we have to have equality and we have to have verification. In the second term, President Reagan decided to send me behind the Iron Curtain to brief the members of the Warsaw Pact. The way that came about was right after our first big summit in Geneva. We were sitting around having a post-mortem on what happened, and President Reagan said, Nitze, what are you going to do? And Nitze said, well, I'm going to go debrief NATO. And he said, Ronnie, what are you going to do? I said, well, you usually send me over to China and Japan. And he said, why don't you go behind the Iron Curtain? He said, you think you can go behind the Iron Curtain and tell them what we're doing? And I said, yes, sir. And Schultz said, oh, that's a dumb idea, Mr. President. It'll never work. He said, well, Roundy said it will work. He said, call up and see if what they say. So I called up a good friend of mine who was the ambassador to Czechoslovakia, because that's where the Warsaw Pact at the time, and he said, sure, come ahead. So I went in and briefed them, and then I went over and briefed Poland, Jaruzelski, and briefed Havel, and the others. And then I got a call from Casey. He said, why don't you go over and brief the Pope? And I said, well, yes, if you tell me to. And he said, yes. Well, I was delighted because it gave me an opportunity to see the Pope, whom I'd known before when he was a bishop. And I said, what are my instructions? What do I say? He said, you don't have any instructions. I don't care what you tell him. He said, I'm not worried about what you tell him. What I want to know is what he tells you. He said, you're absolutely compartmentalized. He said, I know you know Dick Walters, and I'm sending Dick Walters over on the technical side, but I want you to just talk in generalities and find out what the Pope said. Well, I did that, and it worked like a charm. I say that to this day, until Dick Walters died, I never knew what Walters said to the Pope or the Pope said to him. But I do know that Casey and the President were very interested in what the Pope said, and wanted to know what the Pope was also interested in what Jaruzelski said to me and Havel. And at one point, I remember when both Reagan was shot and the Pope was shot, and it was interesting that the Pope said to me, I really admire Reagan's sense of humor. He said, here he is lying with a bullet near his heart, and he's asking these people, look, are you doctors all Republicans? He said, what a sense of humor. And I said, yes, Your Holiness. You know what he said about you? He said, what? I said, Reagan said to me, he said, I just don't understand how a man can forgive somebody that's shot and try to kill him. He said, that man must be a saint. So, no, those were just a few things I remember about this Reagan and peace through strength. But Casey was a real powerhouse in that, and had this great faith in Reagan, and vice versa. Reagan backed him to the hilt.
Thank you. Bill Casey used to love to tell the story that one time when he was doing some briefing in Rome, he was asked a question, and he had some aerials with him, and he said, no, these aerials don't show that, but we'll adjust the orbit, so tomorrow they will. And the fellow said, you can change the orbit of the satellite? Yes, Your Holiness. Okay. John, do you want to add to that?
Okay. Thank you, Owen. I would like to build on everybody's remarks, to which I very firmly subscribe, and particularly Peter Schweitzer's remarks about how important it was that the Reagan administration was devoted to taking advantage of strategic opportunities and vulnerabilities in the Soviet Union. From my perspective as a Sovietologist in those days, one thing that was really very clear to me was that the central fact of political life in the Soviet Union was the Soviet regime's fear of its own people. This was an illegitimate regime that had not been elected by anybody. The consent of the governed was not present. And when the first Constituent Assembly elections took place immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, the people who came to assume that, first of all, the Bolsheviks lost the election to a non-communist socialist party, and when the delegates came to assume their positions in the Constituent Assembly, they were shot. And so the Soviet regime had a big internal security problem, and the various measures by which they exercised totalitarian control over their own people were simply the measure of that internal security problem. Complete control of all communications, all press, all film, all of the educational system, of the economy, of job placement, of internal travel, of housing, control of the borders, neighborhood block committees, the Gulag Archipelago, umpteen different intelligence snitches in each military unit, all spying upon each other, just to make sure that there was no opportunity for internal resistance developing in any cells, in any corner of the Soviet system. The KGB would penetrate sports clubs, historical societies, and everything else that they could possibly penetrate in order to maintain internal security. The importance of internal security was bolstered by Soviet foreign policy. This was explained to me in spades once by a Soviet dissident, the great Vladimir Bukovsky, who spent a third of his life in the Gulag and was then exchanged for the chairman of the Chilean Communist Party and was received by President Carter in the White House. Bukovsky explained that Soviet foreign policy was designed to serve the internal security system of the state by constantly expanding. The message that the Soviets were sending to their own people through their foreign policy was this, as Bukovsky described it. Attention, people of the Soviet Union and of the larger Soviet Empire, we, the Communist Party, can shoot down civilian Korean airliners, we can invade Afghanistan, and we can send arms to the Nicaraguan communists right under the nose of Uncle Sam, and not even the greatest imperialist power in the world can resist us. So if the imperialists cannot resist us, how can you people behind the Iron Curtain, behind the barbed wire and the razor wire and the 200,000 KGB border guards and their snarling dogs, how can you contemplate resisting us? Resistance is futile. Now, the strategic problem here was that the Soviets were vulnerable. They were afraid of their own people. They were afraid of democratic ideas, an alternative concept of legitimacy. They were afraid of the truth, which is why they ruled with lies, their constant propaganda. And so when Joe Detrani talks about how powerful the truth was, that was probably the single most powerful weapon that we had. It was manifested by President Reagan himself in his moral witness, where he would tell the actual truth about the nature of this regime, what it did to its own people, how it behaved abroad. And then we broadcast this truth over the Voice of America, over Radio Free Europe, over Radio Liberty. And by the way, for those of you who don't know it, RFE and RL were both some of the most imaginative creations of the Central Intelligence Agency back in those early days when the CIA was given more free rein to conduct political action. But those radios, the RFE, RL, were each of which were broadcasting in some 15 and 16 to 16 languages, one to the Soviet Union, the other to different countries in East Europe, were a domestic surrogate free press for those countries. And then we were sending in the mimeograph machines and sending in the fax machines and all sorts of other technology and paper, because the party had a monopoly of paper. And all of this had to be done covertly. It was done with great imagination and skill by the agency under Bill's leadership. And so we were telling the truth as a huge part of this. But the problem here was to take advantage or to try to get the peoples of the Soviet Empire to be emboldened to resist, rather than to descend into the mire of that psychological sense of futile resignation, which the party wanted to keep them in so that they would suppress their internal security, and this is where the Reagan doctrine came in that Peter was talking about, where if Nicaraguan campesinos could overthrow a communist government in Managua, then it might be possible that resistance was indeed not futile. And what's so interesting about this was that the Solidarity movement understood this very well. The Solidarity movement, unbeknownst to lots of people, was stealing arms from Soviet munitions depots and was putting them on ships in the Polish port of Gdynia and sending them to Nicaragua to the Nicaraguan anti-communist resistance under the theory that freedom in Warsaw would not happen until there was freedom in Managua. Extraordinary. Well, there were all sorts of other simultaneous crises going on within the Soviet Union. We've talked about the role of taking advantage and this is where Bill was hugely influential in exploiting Soviet economic vulnerabilities. The Soviet economy started its crisis in 1917. That's when the great annual drought started. So the crisis of the consumer economy was nothing new. What was new was the crisis in the military economy and the inability of the Soviet Union to compete with American technological developments, the digital revolution, computerization of guidance systems and all those sorts of things, stealth technology, SDI. All of these things demonstrated a technological sprint capability on the part of the United States that the Soviets simply couldn't compete with. And they were between a rock and a hard place. They either had to reform internally so that they could start creating some of their own innovations to compete with ours, or they had to be dependent upon us. Gorbachev, there was a lot of talk about internal reform in the Soviet system, but they ultimately did very little actual reform. Lots of Sturm and Drang, very little action. As a matter of fact, you could even argue that Khrushchev did more decentralization of economic decision-making during his years in power than Gorbachev did for all of the propaganda that came out of the Gorbachev Kremlin. But the crisis was in this military economy. They couldn't really reform, so they needed the economic bailout, which is what Joe talked about. They were even going to China looking for money. They were trying to get it out of Germany. They were trying to get it out of us. One of the reasons Gorbachev was picked was because he was a good PR man who didn't look like one of those old, middle of the 20th century thugs with the ill-fitting suit. He looked like a good PR man, and he was. Remember when he came down Connecticut Avenue just a few blocks from here, and he jumped out of his car and he started glad-handing on the passersby at the corner of Connecticut and L, and they were all swooning with delight that they had just met, the second coming. And he was very, very skillful at doing this stuff, and they had a massive cultural offensive, a charm offensive that was done in this country, precisely to show that we were not, that they were not a threat to us anymore. There was a very specific strategy which was articulated by several Soviet Soviet officials. We will deprive you of the enemy image. And once that enemy image has evaporated, the entire American military presence in the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean will collapse like a house of cards. Their whole deal was psychological disarmament of the United States, and they were so desperate to try to get the military economic pressure off their military-industrial complex. Bill Casey exploited this by working with the Saudis to try to expand their oil production in a huge way, thereby lowering global oil prices. And the only hard currency the Soviets were ever earning came from the sale of arms, gold, energy, and maybe something else: oil, gas, arms, and gold. Anyway, we deprived them of hard currency doing this sort of thing. There were all sorts of other things that were done. We struggled to prevent one of the Yamal pipeline from coming into Europe, where they could make the Europeans, the gas pipeline, making the Europeans hugely dependent upon Soviet gas, when the Soviets were notorious for engaging in embargoes for political pressure reasons, and so on and so forth. One of the things that Bill did when he was at CIA, in addition to helping supervise some of the different covert actions to exploit these things, was he did various studies, intelligence studies, on Soviet vulnerabilities of their economy, vulnerabilities with regard to civil unrest and disaffection within the community. One of the favorite studies I saw coming out of there was published by a distinguished CIA analyst who was on civil unrest within the Soviet Union, riots, strikes, demonstrations, all sorts of things that few of us were aware of any of these things, and yet the agency had uncovered them, and it had given a huge a huge insight into the internal vulnerabilities that this system had that could be exploited by such things as telling the truth. Ultimately, there was the fact that the president was able to bear moral witness and show, by the way, to the peoples of the Soviet Empire that we had the courage to tell the truth, whereas so many of the president's predecessors had censored themselves about the nature of the Soviet system, and that we were able to stand by them, connect with the peoples of the Soviet Empire, and give them hope. I mean, combined with all these material pressures, when these people started taking to the streets, and they didn't take to the streets for more pay or more vacation time or for OSHA to come and make sure they had clean floors in the workplace. They went to the streets because they wanted radical political reform. And it was this integrated strategy of putting the whole thing together, so much of which was enabled by vulnerabilities analysis done at CIA under Bill's leadership, that made all of this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now, during this period, Henry Now was the Director of International Economic Affairs at the NSC. You were the Soviet desk, and Henry was the International Economic Desk, which was vital to this whole program.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you very much. I'm sort of an unplanned part of this program. And so maybe as an unplanned part of the program on the last panel, late in the afternoon, as the last speaker, I should be brief. But I'm very pleased and thankful to be included, and want to thank my colleagues, John in particular, but also my former student, Peter, who so kindly acknowledged that status. That's a secret weapon of professors, former students. And sometimes they actually go on to outgun us. And in many ways, Peter has. He's written just wonderful material. I myself am exactly, which I have drawn upon heavily in some of the work that I've done on Reagan, not as intensively as Peter has. And so I want to commend this program and this moment, this day of celebration of Bill Casey, and maybe just express the wish that in the future, think about maybe doing this on a college campus.
Sure.
Because that way we could keep alive the legacy of,
we happen to have
Bill
a close
Casey.
affiliation the Caseys do, and obviously Peter closer with the Reagan Ranch and with the Young Americans Foundation.
Terrific.
And
Well, you know,
I, for one, am willing to go to any college campus that I'm invited to.
That's terrific. Oh, and no, I realize that. I'm actually just, I'm inviting myself, or I'm inviting you to George Washington University.
Great.
Where, you know, it's so important for the young people to hear this and to know about this history. I didn't know Bill Casey that well. I simply observed him in quite a number of cabinet meetings, and I would see him from time to time roaming the halls of the old executive office building. He was a life force. I heard that from my colleagues. They would say that, you know, if he visited you, you better be on your toes. He was hands-on. I mean, extraordinary, really. He was hands-on, and you just better know your brief when he walked through your door. I worked on the economic side of the strategy, of Reagan's strategy. That is, mostly on the free market side. I had wonderful colleagues like John and Norman Bailey and Roger Robinson, Joe DeTraney out at the agency, who worked on the Soviet side, on the Soviet economy side of the picture, and who did terrific work in terms of putting these pressures on the Soviet Union and exploiting its vulnerabilities. I was concerned with Ronald Reagan's economic program for the United States and for the free world. And as Peter, absolutely essential point that Peter made about, and John reinforced it, about the strategy of Reagan. There were really 4 parts to it. He was determined, of course, to balance power with the Soviet Union. That was important. That was the role of his defense buildup. He was determined to negotiate with the Soviet Union. We forget that, but in fact he was from the very beginning. He wrote letters to Brezhnev already in 1981 saying, look, I think we can talk about some of these things and we can get something done. That was the second part of his program. The third part was to apply this pressure to the Soviet domestic regime, which he did not regard as legitimate, which was not legitimate, and it was the new element, really, of his Soviet policy. It was the new element of NSDD 75 that said, look, we're going to actually change the character of this regime. We're going to do everything we can, everything within our power, to change the character of this internal regime. So bring pressure on that domestic structure inside the Soviet Union. And then the fourth part of the program, which was equally important, was to revive the U.S. and the Western world economy. Had we not done that, then we might have been in as bad shape as the Soviet Union. You have to remember what the 1970s were like. We were in a serious economic crisis in the 1970s. In many ways, by the way, worse than the one we've just been through, which gets characterized as the Great Recession, when in fact the difficulties in the 1970s were far worse. We had higher inflation, we had higher unemployment, and so Ronald Reagan knew that he had to turn that situation around. And his first year in office, he put out the word that he was not uninterested in foreign policy. We all knew that anyway. He said, but don't let foreign policy interfere with my domestic program. I've got to get this economy and I've got to get this defense build-up underway before I can do anything that I want to do in the foreign policy field. And so that was his commitment. It took a while. It took 2.5 years to bring the economy back. And I will tell just one short story about the nature of Ronald Reagan, and I think indirectly also the nature of Bill Casey and men like Ed Meese and Bill Clark, who I also worked for, the strong character of these people. We went in to see President Reagan in November of 1982. I was there to report on the GATT meeting, which was a meeting of, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which we used to be the International Trade Organization, and I had just been to a ministerial meeting to try to launch a new round of trade negotiations, part of Reagan's program to open up the world economy. It had not gone well. Obviously, we were in the middle of a bad recession. Everybody was mad at us. Europe was yelling at us for the highest interest rate since Jesus Christ, and so on and so on. So the economic situation didn't look very good in November of 1982. That was the beginning of sort of that crucial year of deploying INF missiles in Europe, where, of course, protests were beginning to escalate, street protests against the deployment of those missiles. So things looked pretty bleak in November of 1982. And we went in, and I gave my little spiel about the GATT ministerial and why it didn't work and what we should do about it. And at the end of the session, Bill Clark said to the president, you know, Mr. President, we've got these difficulties now with, you know, the world economy, with the Soviet situation. What do you think we should be doing about this? Should we be thinking about a plan B? And President Reagan sort of looked at Bill Clark for a moment, kind of rocked back and looked up to the ceiling. He says, no, Bill. He said, you know, I don't think so. He says, I think things are going to move along okay. He says, I think the Soviets are going to, you know, eventually come around, and you know, this economy is going to do all right. We'll get there. And my boss, Bill Clark, who knew President Reagan very well, along with Ed Meese and a few others, were about the only ones who could say this to the president. He said, well, Mr. President, if you're so smart, tell me, how's that going to happen? And Reagan, of course, just laughed. And he said, well, you know what, Bill, even if it doesn't happen, he said, what's the worst that can happen to you and me? And Clark sort of looked at him, and Reagan said, we go back to the ranch. How bad is that? This was an extraordinary moment for me, at least. I thought to myself, look at the strength of this man. He knew what he was going to do. He knew what he was in the process of doing. He was going to let it take effect, and if by some, you know, plan of God it didn't work, he was more than happy to go back to the ranch and to be the person that he was. Well, Ronald Reagan did turn that economy around. By the way, a big part of it was something that John just mentioned, and that is and it had a lot to do with Bill Casey, that is getting oil prices down. A dramatic drop in oil prices. You have to remember that in 1984, 1985. I guess it started in 1985, fall of 1985. I remember that because I sold my house right before that happened. And once oil prices dropped, of course, interest rate dropped and my house price went up. But unfortunately, I had already sold it. But that was critical. That really took the wind out of the sails of the Soviet economy. But even more importantly was the tremendous revival of the U.S. and the Western world economy that occurred. We have had 30 years of the most extraordinary growth, the steadiest growth in the U.S. economy and in the world economy than we have had in the history of this country. And that's often forgotten in light of the recent difficulties that we have been through. But this past 3 decades is really an extraordinary period, and it was the basis on which then the Western countries, the United States and the Western countries, were able to make effective those other 3 prongs of the strategy. That is, to keep the pressure on the Soviet domestic system because they couldn't match us. There was no way they were going to keep up with us once we got going. And secondly, to the other 2 pillars to both balance the power of the Soviet Union, that is, deploy those INF missiles, and then to negotiate, and bring the Soviet Union to the table, having blocked the other ways by which the Soviet Union could have achieved its objectives, meaning those ways outside the negotiations. Now the Soviets had to negotiate with you. And of course we got deals in the latter part of Reagan's second term that were very vegan. And like Ed Meese, and I'm thinking to myself, Ed, I heard you speak just a month ago at the Heritage Foundation, and every time I hear you speak, I get recharged, I get regenerated, and I just hope we can keep you around here for a long, long time to come. Because it's a story that we have to keep telling over and over again. The legacy of men like Ronald Reagan and Bill Casey is something that we should really cherish and cultivate for a long time.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody here for sticking it out and staying with us. I know it's been a long day. To me, it's been a very inspiring day. And I want to thank all of the people who have participated as speakers and all of you who have been here as the audience. Immediately following, as you walk out of here, we're going to have a reception. I want all of you who don't know the Institute to at least come meet us. So we're going to have a reception at the Institute of World Politics, which is exactly 1 block. Half a block. It's half a block away. We're on P, and right now we're at 16th and P, and the Institute is 16th and Church, which is half a block away. So it's not, I guess it, what? Half a block north. North. And I guess you'd say that means it's about 6 buildings north from here. So it's not a long trip. For those people who have walkers and so on, we'll arrange for them to come in the back door. And I'll see you there in a couple minutes. Again, thank you very much.